am a professor of industrial organizational psychology at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and I'm here in my office here at GMU. I took my first psychology class as a high school student, and I took it in a summer program at the University of California, Berkeley, and I just loved it. I couldn't wait to read the material, and I loved going to the lectures, and I just knew as a high school student that psychology was awesome, and I definitely wanted to major in it when I got to college. And I did from day one at college at Rice University in Texas. And while I was there, I encountered a lot of incredible researchers doing a lot of interesting things. But at the time, I thought I really wanted to translate my love of psychology into a career in which I could help people. And in my mind, as a sophomore, I thought that the best way to help people was through counseling psychology. So in my junior year, I decided I wanted to do counseling psychology, and I started looking into programs in counseling, and I started putting together applications. And at the same time, I got connected with a person who would become my largest mentor and wonderful advocate. Her name is Mickey Hebel. She's at Rice University in Texas. And I got to do research with her. And she was doing research on things that I felt were really important on diversity, discrimination, gender issues in organizations. And I found that very exciting. And at the same time, I still was committed to this idea of counseling psychology. So I started applying to graduate programs in counseling psychology at the same time that I started an honors thesis related to what turned out to be IO psychology. And so for my undergraduate thesis, I studied women in the construction industry. And I got really excited about trying to understand what these women were experiencing and how organizations might be able to make it better. And so I completed my thesis, and around that time I was admitted to counseling psychology doctoral programs. And so I despite my sort of emerging interest in IO Psych, I decided that I should go ahead and try out counseling psych. And I went to a great program in counseling psych and started learning about how to help people through counseling. And right around that same time, I heard this talk by a researcher named Michael West, who's out in the UK. And he was a very charismatic speaker, still is. And he explained how exciting it is to work in a field where you're helping people. And I thought, well, I thought you could only help people through counseling psychology. And he explained it so clearly to me that when we're studying the workplace, we're studying a context in which people spend most of their time. Most of our time is spent at work. It's not spent with our families. It's not spent, hanging out on the couch. It's spent working. And so if we can make work even a little better for people, then we're really changing their lives. We're really helping people. And sort of having that aha moment at the same time as I had fallen in love with research, I realized that I might actually be able to fulfill my goal of helping people through research in IO psychology. So I actually went back to Rice University after a year in a counseling psych program and never looked back. I've enjoyed every moment of my career since. Well, maybe not every moment, but most moments of my career since. And I've never regretted changing my focus to IO psychology, because I do feel like it's a discipline in which we can help people with our science in real and meaningful ways. So I think there's a tendency for hiring managers or people who are making hiring decisions to go with the gut. In other words, to rely on their feelings or intuition. And of course, those are important factors to consider. And of course, there's relevance in our initial impressions of people. Yet, IO psychology has done a really good job in outlining the ways in which our impressions might also be flawed. And we have to be very careful about making decisions that are unfair to people or that might ultimately negatively impact our bottom line if we're relying on our instinct and not on data or facts, then we might be hiring the wrong people in an unfair way. So we definitely need to avoid doing that. And luckily, IO Psychology has identified those problems in meaningful ways. And it happens at every phase of the selection cycle. So it can happen in who you're recruiting and how you're recruiting them. It can happen in how you are assessing potential employees, whether through interviews or tests or other simulations. So that's another way that it can happen. It can happen through the decision-making process itself, how you're evaluating applicants. And then ultimately it can also happen through how you treat people once they arrive in an organization, how you socialize them, how you integrate them into the workforce of your organization. So there's a number of problems to address at each of those phases of the selection cycle, but they all sort of boil down to using data or facts to the extent that they're available to base your decisions on. So I think any good IO psychologist, or even a student who has just taken an IO psychology class, will say that you have to start with a job analysis. You have to understand what are the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are required of the job for which you're hiring. We don't know who to hire until we know what those KSAOs are. And so once we've identified those KSAOs, or competencies, if you prefer that terminology, then we can really think about, okay, so how do we know that the people who we're interviewing, or the people who we're talking to, or the people who we're testing, how do we know that they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required for this job? And so then you get into questions about the types of measures that are appropriate, and the types of measures that will allow you to discern those KSAOs fairly. And so one of the greatest implications of IO psychology is linking the requirements of the job as defined by the job analysis to the measures that you're using for selecting employees. So for example, if you think you want to hire a person to help you with your PR for your company, you would analyze a PR representative. You would talk to subject matter experts. You would identify the qualities that you think are important in that person with regard to their knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. You can also use ONET, which you've probably learned about in this book, as a source for starting to outline those KSAOs. And you can also use those KSAOs to link back to what you're measuring in your selection tools. And in doing that, you will identify the particular tools that are most relevant for your job. So in the case of a PR representative, it may be very important to have job work samples from prior jobs where they've shown their ability to complete the tasks that are required of a job. And so making sure that you use the same measure for every applicant is one important way to avoid bias, and making sure that you're aligning what you're doing in your selection process with what you're trying to achieve in the performance outcome is another really critical component. And then I guess the last piece of that is making sure your evaluation of those materials is unbiased, and that can involve having rater training, having particular types of rating scales that exhibit less bias. You also should be doing outcome evaluations where you look to see the potential impact on underrepresented groups for the tools that you're using. So for example, if you're using a work sample test or prior samples of work to hire your PR representative, then you need to make sure that using that tool doesn't adversely affect one group more than another. So if using a particular tool means you're hiring more women than men, significantly more women than men, more than 4/5, but proportionally, then you might have a problem. So you need to think about whether the tools you're using are aligned with the job outcomes, and also the potential impact that it can have on groups that are protected by law. So I think from the organizational perspective, it's really important for organizations to be committed to diversity and inclusion in their organization as a whole. And it can't just be window dressing. You can't just put pictures of people on your website who are diverse and expect that that's enough to create an inclusive environment. And so I think when you're talking about organizational level practices and procedures, you really are talking about changing the culture of an organization. And so that takes a real commitment from top management, and it needs to be reflected in every aspect of the organization. And so, for example, some research has suggested that having systems of accountability in place from the top, reporting to the CEO as a member of the board, for example, in the form of a chief diversity officer, or in the form of an individual who is accountable for diversity and inclusion at that very highest level of management. Having a person in that position, having that person reporting to the highest levels of the organization can actually result in more diverse people being hired and promoted in organizations. So that's one key sign of this cultural shift toward diversity and inclusion. And the idea is that having somebody responsible will ensure that the practices and procedures throughout the organization are fair and unbiased, and that there's a culture in which people from diverse backgrounds are valued in the organization. And I would argue that it's important to have not just the fair practices, but also the culture in which those people from different backgrounds are valued for what they bring to the organization.